The sound of beeping monitors filled the hospital room, their steady rhythm marking the final hours of Olivia's life. Outside, the city skyline twinkled, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside the hearts of her family. Her husband, Daniel Carter, sat beside her, his fingers wrapped gently around hers, whispering words only she could hear. Their children, Ethan and Sophie, stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. For 40 years, Olivia and Daniel had been the epitome of a perfect couple. They had the kind of love that others envied, the successful businessman and the devoted wife, raising 2 children in a warm and seemingly unbreakable household. A marriage built on trust, companionship, and unwavering dedication. But now, as Olivia lay on her deathbed, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. There was an unsettling weight in the air, an unspoken truth lurking beneath his father's weary gaze. Growing up, Ethan had idolized his father. Daniel was everything a man should be, strong, composed, an ideal provider. Yet, as he stood by his mother's bedside, watching his father stroke her hand with a tenderness that seemed too practiced, Ethan felt a flicker of doubt. There had always been something peculiar about his parents' relationship, something he couldn't quite put into words. His father was affectionate, yes, but never passionate. He was always there, yet, in some way, distant. Ethan remembered how Daniel would retreat into his study at odd hours, staring at old photographs as if lost in another world. And then there were the letters. Years ago, as a teenager, Ethan had stumbled upon a locked box in his father's study. He never got the chance to open it, but he never forgot the initials inscribed on it, C.R. At the time, he had dismissed it as an old business matter, something unimportant. But now, with his mother's life slipping away, every forgotten detail seemed to resurface, screaming for his attention. Something was wrong. As midnight crept closer, Olivia's breaths became shallow. The doctor had warned them that she didn't have much time left. Ethan leaned in, hoping to hear his mother's final words, expecting a whispered goodbye, a declaration of love, maybe even one last blessing for the family she had so selflessly nurtured. Instead, he heard something that sent a chill down his spine. "Daniel, I knew." His mother's voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of those words sent a shiver down Ethan's back. His father tensed. "Olivia, I knew all along," she murmured, a soft smile playing on her lips. "And I never regretted it." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Knew what? What was she talking about? His father's grip on her hand tightened, his usually unreadable expression clouded with something Ethan had never seen before. Guilt. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent his whole life believing in the story of their family. The love, the stability, the unwavering loyalty. And now, in his mother's dying moments, she had shattered that illusion with 3 simple words. He needed to know the truth, and he was going to find it. What happens next will shock you. What secret had Olivia been carrying all these years? Why did Daniel look so haunted? And what was hidden inside that locked box from Ethan's childhood? The answers will unravel a truth far deeper, more painful, and more shocking than anyone could have imagined. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because this story on that is only just beginning. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. His mother's final words echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. I knew, all along. Knew what? Knew something about his father, about their marriage, about his pulse quickened. For years, there had been little things, tiny cracks in the picture-perfect life he had always believed in, moments that had felt off, but he had never questioned them. Maybe because he didn't want to. He thought back to when he was a child. His father had always been a great parent, gentle, patient, attentive. But there were moments when he felt disconnected, like he was physically present, but emotionally elsewhere. Ethan remembered his parents' anniversary parties, elegant evenings filled with laughter and music. His mother would dress in her finest gowns, glowing with happiness, But his father was different. He would smile, hold her hand, dance with her when expected. Yet, when Ethan watched him closely, he noticed something unsettling. Daniel Carter, the ever-composed, ever-admired businessman, looked detached, as if he were performing a role, not living it. And then there were the guests. His father's circle was filled with powerful men, CEOs, politicians, industry leaders. But there was always a certain kind of guest who intrigued Ethan the most. Refined, artistic men, always well-dressed, always lingering a little too long in conversation with his father. Men whose names Ethan had long forgotten, but whose presence never quite fit the mold of a corporate gathering. And then there was that one time. Ethan was 15 when he woke up one night and found his father in the study, sitting at his desk with a glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. Daniel didn't notice him at first. His gaze was locked onto something in front of him, an old photograph. Ethan, too young to understand but old enough to recognize grief, stepped forward. "Dad?" His father flinched, quickly flipping the photo face down. A rare moment of panic flickered across his face before his usual calm mask returned. "You should be in bed." "Son." Ethan hesitated, staring at the glass in his father's hand. He had never seen him drink alone before. "Are you okay?" Daniel smiled, his usual, practiced smile. "Of course." But even back then, Ethan had felt the lie in it. He glanced at the photo, still face down on the desk. He wanted to ask, but something about his father's posture, the way his shoulders tensed, told him not to. So he said nothing, and neither did his father. Years later, in his early 20s, Ethan found an old wooden box in his father's study. He had been searching for a pen when he stumbled upon it, tucked away in the back of a drawer. It was locked, but something about it felt important. Curious, he had lifted it, turning it over in his hands. That's when he saw them. The initials carved into the lid, C.R., a name he didn't recognize. Before he could investigate further, he heard footsteps. His father. He barely had time to shove the box back into the drawer before Daniel walked in. "What are you looking for?" his father had asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Just a pen," Ethan had lied. Daniel had nodded, then almost too casually walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and subtly checked the placement of the box. Ethan saw it, felt it, but once again, he said nothing. And now, standing in his father's house after his mother's final words, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. Something had always been off, and now he was going to find out why. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had been built on a lie. His mother's final words haunted him, and the memories of his father's strange behavior over the years resurfaced with alarming clarity. He knew where he had to look, the locked box. Daniel had always been meticulous about his belongings, but tonight, Ethan wasn't going to let caution stop him. Under the dim glow of his father's study lamp, Ethan stood before the drawer where he had once found the mysterious wooden box. His fingers hesitated over the handle, but the weight of his mother's dying words pushed him forward. He pulled the drawer open. The box was still there, untouched, just as he remembered it. But now, it felt different. With shaking hands, he searched through the study, finally finding a small key hidden beneath a pile of old letters. He inserted it into the lock. Heart pounding. Click. The lid creaked open. Inside, beneath a stack of aging letters, was a single faded photograph. Ethan picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was his father, young, vibrant, standing at a beach, his arm wrapped around another man, a man Ethan had never seen before. And yet, there was something unmistakable in the way they looked at each other. This wasn't just friendship. This was love. His fingers trembled as he picked up the letters, their edges worn from time. The first one he opened was dated over 40 years ago. "Daniel, I don't know how much longer I can wait. If you choose me, I will leave everything behind. But if you can't, then please at least be happy. I just need to know that you are..." The signature at the bottom sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Christopher, say, R. The initials carved into the box. Ethan tore through the rest of the letters, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Each one revealed a painful truth. His father had loved another man, deeply, passionately. And yet, he had walked away from that love, choosing instead to build a life with Olivia, his wife, his mother. The perfect marriage, the perfect lie. Ethan barely heard his father's footsteps approaching. The sound of his heartbeat drowned everything else out. The study door creaked open. Daniel froze. His eyes landed on the open box, the scattered letters, the photograph in Ethan's trembling hand. For the first time in Ethan's life, his father, the man who had always been in control, always composed, looked afraid. Ethan! Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. But Ethan wasn't interested in explanations. His hands clenched into fists, the photograph crumpling beneath his fingers. You lied to us. Ethan's voice shook with rage. To me, to Mom, our entire lives. You made us believe in something that wasn't real. His father took a step closer. Ethan, it's not that simple. Not that simple? Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You loved him, didn't you? Daniel's face twisted in pain. He didn't deny it. Ethan felt his entire world tilt on its axis. His father, the man he had idolized, the man who had taught him about loyalty, love, and family, had been living a lie all these years. His mother had known. His father had hidden it. And now, Ethan didn't know what to believe anymore. Ethan's breath was ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. The weight of the letters in his hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Across the room, his father stood frozen, his usually composed face now pale, stripped of its usual confidence. You loved him, Ethan repeated, his voice shaking. And you let Mom spend 40 years thinking she was enough. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I looked up to you. I thought you and Mom had something real, something people dream about. He held up the letters, his hands trembling. But this changes everything. His father exhaled shakily. Ethan, I never wanted to lie to you, to anyone, but I had no choice. Ethan's fists clenched. No choice? No choice but to use Mom as a cover, to build a life on a lie. The words hit Daniel like a blow, his face contorting with something between grief and shame. That's not how it was, he said quietly. I loved your mother, not in the way I loved Christopher, but I loved her in the only way I could. Ethan recoiled as if struck. His mother had known. She deserved better. Ethan spat. She deserved someone who loved her completely. Not she knew. Ethan! The voice that cut through the tension wasn't Daniel's. It was Olivia's. Ethan spun around. His mother lay in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Her frail voice, once warm and soothing, now carried a quiet authority. I knew, Olivia whispered again, her gaze locking onto her son's. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. No, he murmured, shaking his head. You couldn't have. Olivia's lips curled into a tired, bittersweet smile. I knew from the very beginning. Ethan, maybe not at first, but as the years passed, I saw it. The way he looked at me versus the way he spoke about him. She glanced at Daniel, and for a brief moment, there was something indescribable in her eyes. Not resentment, not anger, but understanding. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. Then why? His voice cracked. Why did you stay? Olivia sighed, as if the answer had been sitting on her tongue for years. Because love isn't always about grand passion. Ethan, she said softly, sometimes love is choosing to stay, even when you know you're not the first choice. Tears burned at the back of Ethan's eyes. His mother had known. And yet, she had chosen to stay. Your father was a good man, Olivia continued, her voice growing weaker. He may not have loved me in the way he loved Christopher, but he was always there, always loyal, always a wonderful father. And I loved him, not despite his past, but because he was brave enough to keep going. Ethan turned back to his father, seeing him in a different light, not just as a liar, not just as a man who had built a life on secrets, but as a man who had made the hardest choice, one that had shaped their family forever. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he reached for Olivia's hand. She squeezed his fingers weakly, offering him one last silent promise of forgiveness. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, his world shifting in ways he never imagined. His parents' love hadn't been a fairy tale, but maybe, just maybe, it had been real in its own way. The room was silent except for the steady hum of the heart monitor. Olivia's breathing had grown shallower, but her presence still anchored the storm raging inside Ethan. His mother had known. She had chosen to stay. And his father, his perfect, disciplined, honorable father, had lived a life of sacrifice. Ethan turned to Daniel, his anger no longer burning, but a deep ache settling in its place. "Tell me," he said, voice raw. "Tell me everything." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for decades. He turned to the window, where the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the hospital walls. And then, for the first time, he let the past flood back in. "It was 1965, Daniel began, his voice distant. I was 22, fresh out of college, ambitious, hungry for success. That was when I met him." Ethan listened intently as his father spoke a name he had never heard before. Christopher Reynolds. Daniel smiled, a wistful, faraway look in his eyes. He was reckless, passionate. He saw the world as something to be conquered, while I was too afraid to step outside the boundaries drawn for me. Ethan could picture it, his father, young and reserved, drawn to a man who embodied everything he couldn't be. We met at a gallery in New York. He was an artist, a dreamer. He took me to places I had never been, made me feel things I had never felt. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't pretending to be someone I wasn't. Daniel's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. His voice grew quieter. But in those days, love like ours wasn't safe. It wasn't even allowed. The weight of those words settled heavy in Ethan's chest. One night, we were caught together by someone who worked for my father. A single moment, a single mistake, and suddenly, everything I had built, my career, my reputation, my entire future was in jeopardy. Ethan didn't need to ask what happened next. He could already see it unfolding. The warnings, the ultimatums, the fear. My father gave me a choice, Daniel continued, his voice shaking. I could leave Christopher and have the life that was expected of me, or I could lose everything. He paused, closing his eyes as if the memory still hurt to relive. I left him. Daniel took a deep breath, his face lined with regret. I told myself I had no choice, that it was for the best, that I could move on, be someone else, but I never really did. Ethan swallowed hard. His father, the man who had always seemed so strong, so composed, was now just a man who had once loved deeply and lost even more. I met your mother a year later, Daniel continued, glancing toward Olivia. She was kind, beautiful, and most importantly, she was safe. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Safe. His mother had been the safe choice. I didn't marry her out of deception. Ethan, I married her because I needed a life I could survive in. And I learned to love her in my own way. Daniel's voice broke, but I never forgot him. Ethan thought of the locked box, the letters hidden away for decades. He thought of the nights his father had spent alone in his study, staring at old photographs, drowning in what-ifs. His father had chosen his family. But in doing so, he had buried a part of himself alive. And now, after all these years, that buried love was finally seeing the light. Ethan's chest tightened. He had come here looking for a lie. Instead, he had found a tragedy. Ethan sat frozen, his mind reeling from the weight of his father's confession. His whole life, he had believed in a story, a perfect marriage, a devoted father, a stable family. But now, the truth stood before him, fragile and raw, His father had loved another man. His mother had known all along. And yet, they had built a life together, bound not by passion, but by choice. Ethan turned toward his mother, lying weak in her hospital bed. He had so many questions, so many emotions fighting for dominance, anger, sorrow, confusion. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you stay?" A faint smile crossed Olivia's lips. It was a smile full of understanding, of quiet acceptance, because love is not always what people think it is. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "People believe love is fire, passion, but sometimes love is a decision." Ethan's throat tightened. "I knew, long before your father ever said a word," Olivia continued. "There were signs. The way he looked at me, kind, but not in love. The way he never spoke about past relationships. And then," she took a deep breath, "one night, not long after we were married, I found a letter in his jacket pocket. It was from Christopher." Ethan clenched his jaw. "And you still stayed?" Olivia gave a small nod. "Yes." "Why?" His voice cracked. "Because I loved him." She looked at Daniel with so much tenderness that it made Ethan's heart ache. "And he loved me and in the way he could." Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "Olivia, I knew I wasn't his great love," Olivia whispered. "But I was his home." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Olivia turned her gaze to Ethan, her expression filled with wisdom that only years of sacrifice could bring. "Ethan, love isn't always what you read in books," she murmured. "I had a choice. I could have left. I could have hated him. But I saw the man he was, the father he became, the husband he tried to be. And I realized something." She squeezed Daniel's trembling hand. "I wasn't his only love, but I was his constant." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "I didn't deserve you." Olivia smiled, her eyes twinkling with something almost mischievous. "I know." Despite everything, a weak chuckle escaped Daniel's lips. A tear slipped down his cheek. "I never stopped loving you," he admitted. "Not the way I should have, but in the only way I could." "I know," Olivia whispered. Ethan sat in silence, absorbing everything. He had been so angry, so convinced that his father had been selfish. But now he saw the truth. His mother had not been a victim. She had been a choice maker, a woman who had accepted the life she was given and made the best of it. And his father? His father had been a man torn between duty and desire, a man who had tried to love within the limits of his world. His family wasn't built on lies. It was built on sacrifice. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. Olivia's hand trembled as she reached for his. "Ethan," she whispered, her strength fading. "Promise me something." His throat tightened. "Anything." "I forgive him." Ethan turned to Daniel, seeing not a fraud, not a coward, but a man who had lost something he could never get back. A man who had given up everything for his family. A man who had loved in the only way he knew how. The anger that had burned inside him for hours melted away. Ethan let out a shaky breath, gripping his mother's frail hand. "I promise." A peaceful smile touched Olivia's lips. And with that, she closed her eyes for the last time. The house felt different without her. After Olivia's passing, an eerie silence settled over their home. The woman who had been the glue of their family, who had carried the weight of unspoken truths for decades, was gone. Ethan stayed longer than he intended, helping his father sort through her belongings. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the quiet pull of unfinished conversations. Or maybe he still wasn't ready to walk away. But something kept gnawing at him. His mother had known. She had accepted. But one question still haunted him. What happened to Christopher? And why had his father never tried to find him again? Ethan sat alone in his childhood bedroom, staring at the wooden box. He ran his fingers over the carved initials, C.R., the letters that had started this entire unraveling. His father had loved Christopher. That much was clear. But what wasn't clear was why it had ended permanently. His father had chosen his family. Yes, but Christopher had written letters for years. Had Daniel ever written back? Had he ever even tried to go back? Or had he simply buried Christopher alongside his past? Ethan wasn't sure what he was looking for when he opened his laptop and started searching. Christopher Reynolds, an artist from New York, active in the 1960s. The search pulled up old articles, art exhibits, and then a mention of an obituary. Ethan's breath hitched. He clicked on it. Christopher Reynolds had passed away 10 years ago. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His father never knew. Ethan scrolled further. The obituary mentioned no spouse, no children, nothing. Just a single line that sent chills down Ethan's spine. Christopher Reynolds is survived by his artwork and a collection of letters never sent. Ethan's pulse pounded. Had Christopher been waiting for a letter that never came? Ethan approached his father the next morning. Daniel sat at the dining table, staring at a cup of untouched coffee. His face was thinner, older, as if Olivia's passing had taken a piece of him with her. Ethan hesitated, then placed a printout of the obituary in front of him. Daniel's eyes fell on the name, and then his breath caught. He traced the paper with trembling fingers. "He's gone," Ethan murmured. Daniel exhaled shakily, blinking rapidly, as if his mind couldn't comprehend the words in front of him. For the longest time, he said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, broken, fragile, he asked, "Did he ever get married?" Ethan swallowed hard. No, his father's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. A deep, hollow pain settled into his expression. "He waited for me," Daniel whispered. His voice cracked. Ethan's chest tightened. Yeah, silence stretched between them, heavier than it had ever been. And for the first time in Ethan's life, he saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before. Regret. A regret so profound it threatened to crush the man who had always stood tall. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I never wrote back," he admitted. The words hung between them, unspoken wounds finally exposed. "I wanted to," Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day, I wanted to, but I was afraid." Afraid of what? Afraid of losing his family? Afraid of wanting something he could never have? Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent so much time being angry at his father for lying. But now, as he looked at him, this old man who had lost everything, who had buried his love so deep it had turned into a wound that never healed, he didn't feel anger anymore. The house was empty now. After Olivia's funeral, Ethan stayed a few extra days, but the silence felt unbearable. His father hardly spoke, and when he did, it was brief, monosyllabic answers, nods, the occasional sigh. Ethan had never seen him like this. The strong, composed, immovable man he had always known now looked lost. But perhaps that was what grief did. Or maybe it was something deeper. Maybe his father wasn't just mourning Olivia. Maybe he was mourning Christopher, too. Ethan had never planned on doing it, but something inside him, a pull, an instinct, something that felt like unfinished business, led him to pack a bag and book a flight. 2 days later, he stood at the edge of a quiet cemetery in New York, a small bouquet of white lilies in his hands. Christopher Reynolds had been buried in a modest grave, beneath an old oak tree, its branches reaching toward the sky. The headstone was simple, almost too simple for a man who had lived with so much passion. There was no grand epitaph, just his name, and the years he had lived. Ethan swallowed hard. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the stone, trying to picture the man his father had once loved. And then, he reached into his jacket pocket. There, on a folded piece of paper, was a letter. Not from him, but from his father. It had taken everything in Daniel to write it. Ethan had found him sitting at the dining table the night before, staring at a blank page for what must have been hours. "Do you think he hated me?" Daniel had asked, voice hoarse. Ethan had taken a long breath before answering. "I don't think he ever stopped loving you." That was when his father had finally started writing. Now, standing in front of Christopher's grave, Ethan knelt and carefully placed the letter against the headstone. A letter that was 4 decades too late. But maybe, just maybe, some words still mattered, even when spoken to the dead. Ethan didn't tell his father about the letter right away. Not until weeks later, when they sat together in the backyard, the late afternoon sun casting golden hues across the patio. For the first time in years, Ethan truly saw his father, not as a businessman, not as a distant authority figure, not even as a liar, but as a man who had made impossible choices, a man who had sacrificed one love to protect another, a man who had lived with regret, but had never stopped loving in his own way. "Thank you," Daniel murmured. After Ethan told him about the letter, it was the simplest thing he had ever said. But in those 2 words, Ethan heard everything. Apology, love, closure. Maybe forgiveness didn't happen in an instant. Maybe it was a process, like grief, like healing, like love itself. But as they sat there, side by side, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't angry anymore. Some love stories don't get happy endings. Some are buried in silence. Some are lived through sacrifice. But in the end, does love still matter, even if it's never fully realized? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us, would you have made the same choices